Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I've read, one that I read for my friend Bevan's book club, or whatever remains of that book club. I'm still having her recommend books just so I can get my monthly dose of Bevan recommendations, because she does recommend some pretty interesting books. And today's book is all about ghost ? And COVID-19 and the ghost of our past, or whatever. I am referring to The Sentence by Louise Erdrich, which was published in 2021. For those who don't know, Louise Erdrich is an American author from the Chippewa Nation. I talked about her in my recent Poetry Thursday video, so if you want to find out a little bit more in depth about her, maybe watch my video on the Wendigo, the poem that she wrote. She's a Chippewa author. She's written a number of books, novels, short stories, poems, essays, stuff like that. Since the 1970s, she's been writing for quite some time, and she owns her own bookstore, and her work has been highly praised in her time. So I thought it'd be interesting to dive into this book after Bevan recommended it for book club, just because I've been hearing a lot about Louise's name here and there, and I thought it'd be a pretty interesting read. But I have mixed feelings about it, which I'll talk about in the analysis section for this video. But yeah, just a heads up, I will end up talking about the whole book in the summary section. There'll probably be a few spoilers here and there. I feel like that's unavoidable just because the nature of the book and what it's about. I kind of have to go into a little bit more detail. So if you want to find out more about the book, or get a good understanding of it and read it yourself, go out and do that, and then come back and see this video so that no one spoils anything for you. But I just wanted to warn you all ahead of time. And so without further ado, let's talk about this book. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So the sentence focuses on the character of Tookie. She is a member from the Ojibwe Nation, which is in the Minnesota, Midwestern Canada kind of region. She at the start of the story, she's in her 20s. She has a crush on this woman named Danae, who is pining after one of her other lovers, a man named Budgie. Budgie has a wife, and he recently died, and so she's holding on to the body. And Danae wants Tookie to go and get that body, which she does for a cash reward. She ends up getting the body, bringing it across state lines and giving it to Danae, and then going out to eat. And she ends up getting arrested because, one, transporting that body across state lines against the wishes of the wife is illegal, but also the body was filled with drugs, and Danae and Budgie's wife had sold out Tookie. And so she ends up getting sentenced to life in prison. But thanks to the tireless work of her lawyer, she's able to get pardoned, and her sentence is commuted. After she gets out of jail, she goes to work for a bookstore that has some regular customers, and also has a number of other natives working for the bookstore as well. One of the regular customers, Flora, ends up dying, and Tookie believes that Flora's ghost is haunting the bookstore. Although she's really the only one who can kind of sense it. Other people can hear things, but they don't really see anything like Tookie does. Tookie feels compelled to read a book. I think it's called The Sentence or something like that. But she feels compelled to read it, which is about a an indigenous woman who was forced to be white and provide comfort services for men a while back, but in the recent history as well. This was the book that Flora was reading, and Tookie believes that a sentence in the book killed her. And Tookie chooses not to read the book and even goes so far as to bury it so that she doesn't die when she reads it as well. Pollux, which is Tookie's wife or Tookie's husband, and Tookie are visited by Hedda, who is Pollux's daughter, not related to Tookie at all. And although Hedda and Tookie have had their differences in the past, Hedda is much more easier to be around now that she has had a baby, and they grow and bond through the story, even though Tookie's mouth kind of gets her into trouble at times. COVID happens in this story because the story takes place in 2019 through 2020, and the bookstore has to shut down, but it eventually reopens once they get essential worker status, and but only one person is allowed to work in there at a time, and Flora's ghost becomes more aggressive during this time, stinging Tookie's hand, or even just like stealing books or pushing them off the shelves, trying to become more aggressive, even going so far as to try to enter her body and possess her, representative of how Flora, a white woman, was trying to be or tried to feign indigenous heritage throughout her life. The George Floyd protest, because this is Minneapolis, this takes place in Minnesota, the George Floyd protest happened at this time, and this puts Tookie into conflict with Pollux. Pollux used to be a reservation cop, and even came into conflict with Tookie from time to time because she was a rebellious youth. And Pollux is upset that violence is happening and riots are happening in Minneapolis, but he understands why, and he's frustrated with the police. Mostly he just wants to help the elders, and he's working with other indigenous people in the community in order to prevent violence being done against indigenous businesses and whatnot, just trying to keep the youths on the straight and narrow path. We also hear from one section from Pollux where it seems like he's indicating that Tookie has gone through breakdowns in the past, calling into question whether or not there's an actual haunting, or if this is in Tookie's mind as a result of the stress and trauma that she's experienced in the past. Pollux unfortunately gets COVID in the story, and it gets pretty serious, and he ends up in the hospital. Tookie is alternating between staying in the hospital parking lot and working at the bookstore. Tookie and some of the other bookstore workers have what appears to be a seance where they learn a bit more about Flora's ancestry, and it turns out that Flora, one of her ancestors, was the woman in the sentence book that kidnapped Native American women. Which was so heart-wrenching for her and so against what she believed or she wanted for herself that it seemingly kills her. But Tookie also learns that Flora, while Tookie's mom was pregnant, took care of Tookie's mom and made it okay so that she wouldn't overdose or anything, which allowed Tookie to be born. And so Tookie sees the connection between her and Flora that she might not have necessarily seen before. Presumably at this point, Flora passes on, and interestingly, the bones that I mentioned earlier in the story were returned. And as the story ends, Tookie realizes that she has the capacity to share her love with Pollux and Hedda's baby, who she finds very adorable, Jarvis. And so it ends on a bit of a high note there with some hope for the future, and that's where it ends. In terms of analysis, there is a little bit to talk about with this story. Louise Erdrich really just focuses on the idea of a haunting, although there are some other ideas that she's throwing out there that don't necessarily work or provide an avenue for an alternative story. So there's not enough room here for everything that she's presenting, but the main idea is that of a haunting. Tookie is haunted by Flora, as well as her own past. Flora died, and she's come back to haunt the bookstore. Simple as that. And Tookie is trying to find out why Flora is haunting the bookstore, and she is also sort of remembering her past. It's making her a bit uncomfortable, and it's also a bit sad because it seems like Tookie feels like she's not worthy of being with Pollux, of having this life that she's having because of some of the unfortunate things that might have happened in her past relating to her difficult relationship with her mother, her non-existent relationship with her father, and the fact that she was in prison for so long. Which we find out why that's haunting her precisely later in the story. But initially, like the haunting of Flora, like Flora's haunting this bookstore is a mystery. Why is it happening? Tookie initially believes that it might just be because of the book, that it needs to be read. But as Tookie reads it, she becomes worried that reading the passage that Tookie read will kill her. She also thinks it's because like the coroner burned the wrong body or incinerated the wrong body, cremated the wrong body, I believe is the word. And so burning the body will fix things, but that doesn't fix things either. And the big reveal is that essentially, Tookie thanks Flora for what she did for her mother. That because Flora was there when her mother needed her, and she's been a big help towards Indigenous folks in need, that Tookie recognizes this and appreciates her hard work. Even if Tookie did try to pretend to be Indigenous from time to time, she wanted to be a wannabe, essentially. She was a wannabe, as one of the other characters says. So that's the big reveal, and in doing so and thanking her, Flora seemingly passes on, and Tookie doesn't think that Flora is going to be coming back anytime soon. And at the same time, Tookie is crushed by the trauma of the past and present. As I mentioned, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in her past. There's stuff happening in the future. It's kind of reminding her of that past. Like the George Floyd protests remind her of how ruthless the police were to her, including kind of like Pollux. Pollux wasn't exactly brutal to her, but he did arrest her, and he was one of the reasons she ended up in prison for 10 years of her life. And the COVID and the fact that there's so much uncertainty and reality feels weird, like it's only reminding Tookie of the strangeness of everything that's going on, and it's adding to the stress and uneasiness that she feels. There's a good quote that I would like to read to you from this. "Sometimes as I am waking between sleep and consciousness, I am afflicted with a wave of crashing sorrow. Where this wave comes from or why this moment is so bitter and deep, I don't know. It just happens to me. I stay still as though I have a knife in me, afraid to jostle this feeling and make it worse. But I know it won't go away unless I submit to it, and so I feel it." Which is a very interesting quote for a number of reasons. Like, one, it shows the beautiful writing. The writing in the story like flows. I do have to give Louise Erdrich credit for writing such a beautiful story that really enthralls me at times. But it also shows the sadness that Tookie feels, maybe on a constant basis, because she's dealing with this trauma and these regrets from her past, relating to her mother, relating to jail, relating to things that happened in her era of rebelliousness, and how she's not completely over it, and the George Floyd protest and what's going on with Pollux right now, it doesn't make her feel any better, and it might be exacerbating whatever she's going through. So for Tookie, Louise Erdrich does a great job of showing how she's dealing with all of this and how it's just playing out in the form of like her own personal haunting, even outside of what's going on with Flora. But Tookie isn't the only one who's haunted in this story. Minnesota is haunted as well. Tookie notes that Minneapolis has a racist history that it hasn't reckoned with. And so this protest, this riot that breaks out after George Floyd's death is Minneapolis' sins being reckoned with. And the same goes to the nation, because a bunch of other protests broke out in other cities during COVID and continue to break out. And so the nation hasn't addressed its demons. It hasn't addressed the ghost of its past. So it's continuing to be haunted until something happens, until something new comes along, until we manage to heal and address the problems that our country has as it pertains to people of color, as it pertains to natives, as it pertains to women, as it pertains to so many other things. Natives themselves are haunted in this story, often by the bones of their ancestors because white people refuse to return them. So Erdrich does a great job of showing that the haunting is the case for Tookie, as well as in a grander scale, it's happening for the state of Minnesota and the country as well. And that the healing will come from addressing the past. You can't simply run from the issue. Tookie can't simply run away from Flora. She has to own up and acknowledge the role that Flora had in her life, or she's never going to heal from all these traumas that she faced in the past. And I do think it's a very good message and a very interesting way to talk about ghost. Certainly not the most original way, as I'm sure other people have done it before, but it is still a good message. But here I think it's a little bit diluted because of the scattered focus of the story, which I'll talk about in a few moments. Like she focuses on the ghost story, and like this is a ghost story until it becomes something else. Like it becomes a story about COVID, or it becomes a story about the George Floyd protest, or a story about police violence. Like Erdrich constantly changes the focus of the story, and I feel like this overall message is kind of hurt by it. Erdrich also goes on to talk about the power of books. Given that this takes place in a bookstore, that would make sense. But it's kind of annoying to hear that message, especially given that so many other authors have written about the power of books and how they can be very helpful, especially during rough times like a pandemic, like during a protest, and how people find comfort in books for a number of different reasons. And that's a good message. That's like an interesting thing to say if Erdrich was the first person to say it, and she is definitely not. And coming from someone who owns a bookstore, which Louise Erdrich does, as I mentioned before, it feels a bit masturbatory. Like, books are super important. Why don't you buy them at my bookstore? And also made even worse is that there's a character in this story who I think either works there or owns the bookstore, whose name is Louise. And again, this feels incredibly masturbatory. Why would you write yourself into your own story? I think Stephen King does that from time to time, or some other authors do, and it always feels like immersion breaking, because you're taking me out of the story and reminding me that it's written by you, and you're like, look at me, aren't I interesting, aren't I worthy enough to be written about? And I say no, like, don't write yourself into your story. Maybe that's on me, like that's my own personal opinion, and other people are okay with it, but I feel like writing that books are very powerful, and then writing yourself into your own story is, again, like masturbatory. It's a dumb word to use, but I feel it's appropriate in this situation. As I mentioned before, the writing is phenomenal in this story. Louise Erdrich does have a way to suck you in and make the story enthralling, which is always a plus. And I do like how the book is sort of like bookended by the transporting of a body. In the beginning, it's Budgie who's transported across state lines, and that gets Tookie into trouble. And then at the end, one of Tookie's friends does it, but a body is still transported across state lines, and it's the remains of the indigenous person from long ago. And that's sort of meant to be a healing moment. So what causes trouble in the beginning is also something that heals in the end. I think that's a really beautiful kind of interesting storytelling device on Erdrich's part. And the fact that she doesn't call attention to, like I think so many lesser authors would, and lets the reader discover that on their own, is something that I think is worth mentioning here as well. And then also the section where Pollux makes a confession is well written, but also very interesting because it kind of changes the sort of tone of the story, where it goes from being a ghost story to being a story about a woman's breakdown because of the stressors in her life from her past and her present. And it can be both, I think, but if you hear from Pollux, like it's suggested that there might not actually be a ghost here, and that everyone is kind of indulging Tookie as she travels along the road to her accepting of her own past. That might be the case, but I certainly think that that like it's a very interesting kind of element to add to a story, especially when we don't hear from any other character besides Tookie throughout the story. Of course, as I mentioned before, the story does have a bit of a scattered focus. Erdrich kind of stops the ghost story for a moment to talk about COVID and to talk about the George Floyd protest and the conflict that arises with Pollux as a result. And it feels kind of like disjointed in that way, and it happens in the beginning too. Like in the beginning, she starts talking about Danae and transporting the body across state lines and ending up in prison, and these all feel like different stories that you could tell. And she just glosses over the fact, like the entire first chapter is just like, I transported a body across state lines, I went to jail, and then I got work at a bookstore, and that all feels like a different, a couple different journeys that you could take, and she just glosses over all of it. And then she like could tell an individual story about COVID and the George Floyd protest or any other protest, and she just keeps glossing over it to get to like some other point. And she like that also happens with the ghost story, where it feels like it's not really a ghost story, it's just a feature of this story. And I don't know what the point is here. I don't know what the overall message that Erdrich is trying to make, because she never devotes enough time to each individual thing. And it seems like at the end of the story, she just rushes and she's like, oh yeah, by the way, about the ghost, that was something to do with Tookie's past. And then she just rushes to the end of the story. And I think one of the issues is that, well, actually, there's two issues. One, it reminds me of Meg Cabot. Like, this is Meg Cabot levels of not having a point. If you're familiar with my videos on the Princess Diaries series, which is never a comparison you want to have in a story. Like, this is definitely better writing than Meg Cabot for sure. But it definitely made me think of the Princess Diaries, where I'm like, where's she going? Does she have anything to say, or is she just telling me a bunch of events that are happening in the life of Tookie? But also the problem is that I think that as Louise was writing, COVID happened, and then the George Floyd protest happened, and she like maybe she had an original story that she wanted to tell, but she thought she could include these elements too, and that just it doesn't work. It doesn't like it completely like separates the flow of the story and just prevents you from like telling a more coherent story. It doesn't completely dismantle it, because again, she does include the themes of like the nation's past and Minnesota's past not being fully addressed and coming back to haunt them. But it still makes me wonder what the point is of this story, like what the focus is, and how Louise Erdrich seems to lose the plot as it goes along. And that might just be more on me, but I'm sure other people might see it too. Anyway, these are my thoughts on The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. It's a pretty good book that was a lot of fun to read, mostly because of Erdrich's compelling writing. She definitely manages to suck you in, as I've said before, and I think her book should be commended because of that. But I do think that like good writing alone can't save this, that there are a number of problems that make it really hard to recommend to other people. Like I did enjoy it, but I'm not going to say, oh, you should go read this book, especially because it kind of feels meandering at times, in terms of not really having a complete point that it's trying to make. And so, yeah, I guess I'd say I don't recommend it. However, I don't want to completely drop Louise Erdrich in terms of not reading her in the future, like I would with so many other authors. Because of that writing, I think her writing is strong enough to maybe seek out more of her work. I would like to see, because this is her later work, I would like to see more of her earlier work and see maybe how she got to a point like this where she was writing these kind of stories. So something worth checking out in the future. If you read this book before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about The Sentence. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author and this book if they do not already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and ghostly travels. Farewell.